Welcome, Sayash Kapoor. Where are you today? Where are you joining us from?
I'm joining from Washington, D.C.
Great. And are you there normally, or are you normally at Princeton?
So Princeton has a new office in D.C. where I sit out of sometimes. So that's where I am.
Sayash is an author of this book, AI Snake Oil, which I have not read in its entirety, but I've read quite a bit of it and turned down a bunch of pages, and I'll probably refer to it a couple times today. He was a former software engineer at Meta, working on content moderation systems, the AI that's used to hopefully improve the quality of social media. And he talks about that in his book in terms of the challenges that AI had and has in terms of moderating social media. And as a PhD student at Princeton, which Sayash has to lead me to the very first question. Like, you had it made, dude. You're working at Meta, probably paid pretty well. Why'd you go back to school?
I ask myself the same thing sometimes. But like, to be very honest, while I was working at Meta, this was back in 2019 or so, that was when the EU had sort of finalized its GDPR, its global data protection rules. And I saw what change that single policy lever had within the entire organization. Every single team, whether it is ads or product or integrity, all of these teams were now required to sort of make changes in accordance with the policy. And I saw what simple sort of edits to this policy, simple changes to this policy, what an outsized impact they could have on real world products. So I was really inspired. I wanted to sort of build policy, not just policy for the sake of policy making, but for policy that drives better outcomes in the world. And so I decided to start my PhD at the Center for Information Technology Policy at Princeton.
And are you focused on policy or AI or both? Like, tell me what your focus is, and then talk about the inspiration to write the book. I think with another faculty member at Princeton, AI Snake Oil.
That's right. Yeah. So a lot of my work is actually doing technical research that informs good policy. Unfortunately, many times the policy proposals that are often circulated on the Hill or even in state level legislation are practically infeasible. They might be impossible to implement. They might have a really high cost for compliance. And that's not what the policymakers really want. But because of this absence of tech expertise within policy, sometimes we do get these proposals. So a lot of my work in the last few years has been doing technical research, but then using the outputs of that research to inform policymaking on those topics. For example, over the last year or so, we did a lot of research on foundation models that are released openly, things like Meta's Llama 3. In the beginning, there were some proposals for regulating these models that would sort of have been impossible for these developers to implement. One example is requiring strong watermarks that can't be removed by downstream actors is something that's not technically possible today. And so such a requirement is essentially equivalent to banning open models. And of course, the legislators who wrote these requirements didn't often intend for these requirements to sort of lead to a de facto ban. So this is where
they had good intentions. They had good intentions, presumably, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. Unaware of how it works. Okay. And then connect to the book. What was in, because I know writing a book is hard. I've tried. Tell me why you took on that task and what you want to accomplish or what you have with the book.
So I think one of the main reasons we wrote the book was simply because both my co-author Arvind and I really believe in the potential for AI to be transformative. But at the same time, we also see a number of claims about AI that are just rampant and misleading. And we think at the core of the book is this hypothesis that, if we are to make good and productive use of AI across the sectors of the economy, that we need to clamp down on snake oil that is also being sold under the same name. And I think one of the most confusing things about AI today is that it is this umbrella technology that is used to refer to things that have entirely different technical conceptions at the heart. And companies often use this confusion to exploit products that don't work and sell them under the brand name of AI.
And you talk about that obviously in the first part of the book, the different types of AI. Obviously, we have kind of the origins perhaps in machine learning, or I'm sure before that, but how we would think about it as consumers, maybe, the algorithms, right, that control some of our lives or some of our attention anyway. And then we have predictive AI, we have generative AI. Just give us maybe a quick view of those and where's the most snake oil. Because I see quite a bit in generative AI, but I think you think there's more in predictive AI. So just give us a survey there.
I think the two broad types of AI that we consider in the book are predictive AI and generative AI. Broadly speaking, predictive AI is AI that's used to make predictions, often about individuals. and then on that basis, make extremely consequential decisions. So for example, we've seen the proliferation of predictive AI in hiring. We have a number of hiring automation tools that promise on the basis of, let's say, a 30-second video interview to predict if a job candidate would be actually suitable for a job. Now, of course, if we think about this from a first principles common sense perspective, predicting the future should be impossible. But when it comes to AI, we seem to have suspended common sense in many cases. And predictive AI is sort of banking on the perception that actually generative AI has, because it has made genuine technical advances. But those same advances don't apply to predictive AI. And in most cases, when we've analyzed these technologies, when we've sort of dug down just a little bit deeper, we found that these tools don't really work well at all. So one example is this hiring automation company called Retorio claimed to sell hiring automation tools, but when it was investigated by a group of researchers, they found that it's like a video interview of a candidate. If you simply change the background of a candidate from like a plain background to adding a bookshelf in the background, the candidate scores increased dramatically. And mind you, this is for the same exact video of the candidate. Mm-hmm. And this is the sort of thing that we continue to see, whether in hiring or education or criminal justice. We've seen these predictive AI tools being used all over the place without too much accountability on how well they work.
And I guess the sales pitch works, right? We need shortcuts. We're overwhelmed with job candidates or whatever it might be. We don't have enough. Or in the criminal justice system, right? That system is probably completely understaffed related to the the work they need to do. We want them to do at some level, and so I guess that's the sales pitch works presumably because we think we need them, but the solutions don't. And so I guess what you're saying for all of us is, as it relates to buying predictive solutions or maybe even using them, we should come in with a much more of a skeptical mindset in terms of do these things actually work? Is that fair?
That's exactly right. And oftentimes these tools are sold with this huge promise of full automation, but then when things go wrong, the developers retreat to the fine print that actually says, oh no, you had to vet every single decision from this tool with a human in the loop. And right. That does not really make too much sense from a procurement perspective, simply because the very reason for adopting these tools was to automate a significant chunk of labor. And so this is what we've seen time and time again. In fact, we compiled over 4 dozen instances of predictive AI use across these different domains. And we think there are many sort of things going wrong with most of these applications that have been deployed.
Okay, so let's switch to generative AI. Talk about wild claims. Let's switch to generative AI then. It seems like the claims are just as wild, if not more wild. That we're going to cure cancer. We're going to solve climate change. We're going to we're all not going to be working. We're all going to become painters and artists and poets or whatever and collect our UBI checks. So I don't know. To me, the claims seem to be as fantastical or more so with generative AI, but you seem less skeptical of generative AI.
I mean, to be clear, I am quite skeptical of those specific claims.
Sure.
I think the specific sort of thing that's different for generative AI compared to predictive AI is that underlying generative AI is a real actual technical accomplishment. So we have made progress over the last 10 years in improving our models so that they can output text, have conversations with users, output realistic images based on just text descriptions of them. And I think this will continue to progress. Where I differ or where I disagree with like many of the industry leaders' claims, AI will cure cancer or solve climate change or whatever, is that I don't really think we're on that path at all. I don't think we're on the path to building super intelligence, as some like to call it, that can sort of magically cure all of our societal ills. I do think that generative AI is a transformative technology, but we can compare it to past general purpose technologies, things like internet, that did qualitatively change the way we communicate, the way we do most knowledge work. We wouldn't have been able to have this conversation without the internet. And yet it is not this singularity, this all-encompassing invention that is considered by many people as like the last invention that humanity needs to make. I don't think we're on that path.
Could you describe the path we're on as relates to knowledge work, next 5 years, generative AI? Put those 3 together for me.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, I mean, one thing that one thing that I personally think will happen is we'll continue to see the need for developers who find product market fit on top of generative AI. I think companies have only begun to internalize this lesson. So when ChatGPT launched, I think many of these language model developers, like OpenAI and Anthropic, felt like the only thing they need to do is to make the models better. But very quickly, they realized that that's not really a viable strategy. That's not really a good business plan. For example, these models might have the capability to write good code, but in industrial settings, you often need these models to interact with a million-line code base. And so it wasn't for the next couple of years until we actually figured out what useful applications look like. We have applications like GitHub Copilot, like Cursor AI, which were required in order to essentially get the benefits of these language models in writing code. So economists describe these as complementary innovation. So there's the primary innovation of the general purpose technology, but then you also need the complementary innovation in the actual productive sectors of the economy to materialize the impact of this primary innovation. And we've seen this before. The story has played out like half a dozen times with previous general purpose technologies. One of my favorite examples is in the 1880s, we already had electricity. And people initially tried to naively use electricity by replacing steam engines and factories. And that didn't work. That wasn't really more efficient. And it took the next 40 years for people to realize that the way to make electricity work for you is to reorient the entire design, the apparatus of the factory around the fact that we now have electricity. And so in some cases, I think 5 years from now, we'll be living in a very similar world as we do today. The models will be much more capable, but this complementary innovation needs to be done one domain at a time. We need to figure out what the right application for lawyers are, what the right application for coders are, and so on. And we need to do the hard work of incorporating these applications into the existing processes, into the productive sectors of the economy. And that's how we'll realize the economic impact of AI.
So from the generalization to the specific, do you think the specific is, and maybe I'm just, maybe it's just semantics here, but is it by function, like role, like, finance versus sales versus marketing, or is it by industry, pharma versus transportation versus retail, or both, or it doesn't really matter, meaning entrepreneurs, some of these frontier model companies maybe as well, they're gonna attack the biggest opportunities first, presumably, right, where they see the most amount of value. And so that's what's happening. That's what's happening right now for the next 5 years. From the generalized to the specific, do you think it's job function or industry or both?
I think there'll be a lot of experimentation that's needed. I think we have to try things out at different levels. It might turn out that we can build sort of job function specific applications that generalize across industries. It might turn out that we need to build specific applications in a specific industry. I mean, for past technologies, we've even had to build specific applications in medicine, for instance, for one particular hospital system. That's the level at which software development often happens. So
Right.
even putting it one layer above that, I think would be a big, big win.
Right.
And so just to be clear and just to reiterate, I do think this will have transformative effects, but it won't have transformative effects in the next 5 years. It'll take like a decade or two until we actually see the diffusion of AI across these sectors of the economy. And there'll be a lot of experimentation that happens in that time. And I think that's a very good thing, because that's how developers will find product market fit. That's how they'll realize what works and what doesn't work. And I think when AI companies sort of hype up these futures where, by the end of the decade, we'll get to AGI that will solve all cognitive labor, they're in some sense undermining their own accomplishments, which I don't think are small by any means. I do think generative AI is a big technical accomplishment. I just don't think it'll lead us all the way to AGI or artificial superintelligence.
Right. So why are they doing that? I mean, first of all, your timelines are more, seem to be more realistic, more conservative, longer, right? You're talking about 10 plus years in terms of actually changing the way work gets done. Sounds right to me. So why do you think, is it just to raise money? These guys, Sam Altman and crew, Darius, keeps talking about, we won't need, human software engineers soon. Why do you think the claims are so outlandish and the timelines are so compressed from their perspective?
I think there are sort of three different reasons that come into play together. The first is, of course, the business incentives. So you do need a fair amount of hype. You do need like a small bubble in order to raise the money that you need for these big infrastructure projects. And at the end of all of this, even if AGI doesn't arrive, you've built all of the computing infrastructure we need for carrying out these knowledge work tasks. Let's say in 10 years, we have a lot of expertise. We have trained a lot of people. In some sense, the internet bubble also did a similar thing for e-commerce websites that were created in the 1990s. So there is this productive function that bubbles up. There's the second reason is that there's a lack of accountability for these tall claims. So Dario, who's the CEO of Anthropic, has made claims about AGI that are now several years in the past. So he has at various points claimed that we'll get to AGI by 2020 or 2023. And it's not like someone is holding him accountable to these claims. And so there isn't really any repercussion for things going wrong. There's a lot of upside for things going right. And I think a third thing, which is somewhat distinct, is what explains what workers in these industries, rather than the industry leaders, why they believe in it. And I think there is this strong sort of self-selection bias, where people who are more likely to believe that they're contributing towards, let's say, humanity's intellectual successor, are more likely to go work at these companies, at OpenAI or Anthropic. And in fact, from what I've heard, these companies also select quite heavily for believing that AI will have this imminent transformative impact. So I think that sort of completes the feedback loop where your entire intellectual community believes the same thing. It's very hard to get out of. And then when your CEO repeats the same thing, when your company's valuation, when the value of your stocks all depend on the same thing, I think it's really hard to get out of that bubble, even if people are trying to be intellectually honest.
Yeah, Sayash, that's a great insight. It also makes it easier to ask people to work 6 or 7 days a week. I think the pace of work inside of companies like OpenAI and Anthropic is high. I'm sure you have the same sense, versus maybe Meta, where everybody's working part-time. So if you're going to ask people to work that hard for extended periods of time. In fact, Sam Altman was a little bit complaining yesterday on X. I'll read you the quote. Be me, Sama said, grind for a decade trying to help make superintelligence to cure cancer or whatever. Mostly no one cares for the first 7.5 years. And then for 2.5 years, everyone hates you for everything. Wake up one day to hundreds of messages. Look, I made you into a twink Ghibli style, haha. Because I guess they released, obviously, well, no, I guess they released image generator, and now it can make Ghibli style, images. So I think that's, if you're gonna work for 10 years, or at least 7.5 years in obscurity, 6-7 days a week, it's easier to do that, I think, if you can talk yourself into believing that you are going to kind of solve humanity's ills by creating a super intelligence. Although I'm not sure why he's complaining about it at this point. Anyway, there's so much what you said. I want to connect it to an essay that we're working on, a section that I'm working on, a section called Canaries in the Coal Mine. I have a point of view. I want to get your opinion. And although my VP of engineering just reminded me that, well, Greg, the canaries in the coal mine, the canaries die when there's too much gas. But my point of view is that engineers, software engineers, are the canaries in the coal mine for knowledge work, meaning they're the first sort of, large group of people using AI really significantly in their day-to-day. You're an engineer, you obviously use tools like GitHub, Copilot, Cursor, Klein, whatever. Do you agree? Meaning, are you sort of experiencing what other knowledge workers will experience soon in the next 5 or 10 years? Meaning, really relying on and using these tools daily, maybe hourly.
Yeah, I do think that's going to be the case as we develop useful applications across industries. So what we're seeing in software engineering is just the fact that these applications that incorporate AI into knowledge work have now found product market fit. GitHub Copilot has an annual revenue of, I think, over $300 million US. Cursor over 100 million. Windsurf is a Cursor competitor, has, I think, over $40 million. And this is quickly increasing. And so once we find product market fit, I think that is a far better indicator of the utility of an application than anything we could do at the level of the foundation models themselves. So we could run these models by like 1,000 different benchmarks, but this adoption is always going to be the primary signal of having found this fit. And I do think many other knowledge work industries will soon have the Cursor moment. I think progress is underway, though perhaps not as quickly. In legal tech, in finance, in medicine, where companies are trying to adopt these tools for smaller or bigger things. So for example, we have seen many examples of medical transcription tools that use AI to ease up doctors' paperwork. I think that is fantastic. And I think we need more of these tools. We need to test them more reliably and then ultimately encourage adoption as quickly as possible. But at the same time, I don't think we should oversell how quickly we can find product market fit. And we should be relying on actual adoption metrics by domain experts, like software engineers in this case, for evidence that something works rather than simply looking at benchmark numbers.
Yeah, it feels like to me, I like that idea, like $100 million in ARR. That typically for a startup, my last startup, it took too long and too much dilution and too much capital and too many years off my life. But eventually that startup got to $100 million in ARR. And at that point, they typically, they get to survive, they get to live, right? If not continue to grow. So maybe that's the right benchmark. 100 million ARR as an investor, as an entrepreneur, is a good benchmark, right? That means you've done something that does have product market fit. Maybe that's what we should be looking at for all these companies like Glean or Harvey for law, or Hippocratic AI for medical, and so on. I want to go back to something you said though around Dario and others have not really been held accountable for their wild claims and hype about AI. I do think there's some accountability though. It feels like to me, Sayash, coming from the enterprise, because if enterprise customers are a source of revenue and that hype is brought over to the enterprise, I think enterprise customers get pretty frustrated pretty quickly if this thing, if AI doesn't add value and doesn't work as promised. So maybe government, maybe consumers, maybe the media doesn't hold them accountable. But I do feel there's a reckoning coming if the hype is not matched. When these tools actually hit the enterprise, because the CFO's like, what the hell, like these things don't work, and where's the ROI? Just curious on your perspective on that.
Yeah, and I think like that's why the messaging you see from companies for enterprise customers versus when policymakers ask them to testify in front of the Senate is actually very different. So for enterprise consumers of Claude, which is Anthropic's AI assistant, the positioning is, you can speed up your business processes, you can improve productivity, and so on. But in front of the government, like Sam Altman back in 2023, actually literally went up in front of a Senate committee and asked them to issue licenses for AI companies. So like a company needs to have a license before it can start training advanced AI models, which in any other industry would be seen as like a brazenly anti-competitive demand. Sure. But in AI, because you have the shield that, we have imminent superintelligence, that wasn't really the way it was perceived.
Yeah, and now I guess they're also saying, like, we need this because China will get it before us, right? And so, let us violate all the copyright. In fact, they're appealing directly now to Trump, President Trump, I think, and at least the inner circle of that administration. Obviously, Elon is in the inner circle, somewhat of a conflict, but and then hey, help us get the favorable rulings we need from the legal system. It appears so that, and if you don't, the Chinese will do what they want, and they'll have better AI. So they sort of up the stakes even more, right? Like it's or I guess I don't know if it's more than super intelligence, but it's become a national competitive kind of risk as well, I guess. It's clever. It will probably work, quite frankly. As you know, obviously, the Trump administration rescinded the Biden administration in terms of the AI safety guidelines. Having said that, there seems to be pretty muscular regulation in about 12 US states, I think, moving through state legislatures. Let's not spend too much time here, Sayash, but are you optimistic there will be some level of oversight? Or is all AI going to be unhinged like rock?
I think I'm more optimistic than it might seem. So I do think a patchwork model here does end up working pretty well in the end. We have states which are introducing legislation for known harms. So for example, one of the things I'm very concerned about is image generation tools being used for non-consensual deepfakes. And I think over 30 states at this point have introduced legislation against it. There has been federal legislation that has been introduced as well, though it hasn't yet passed, but in states it has started passing, and there's like this patchwork coming into shape. At the same time, like many of the more speculative concerns around extinction or civilizational collapse have sort of receded from the policy agenda. That's another thing that makes me hopeful because, in 2023, policymakers were suddenly sort of awash in claims that we'll all die as a result of rogue AI. And I think many of them started to come up with these proposals. But looking back, once they've started to see the evidence, I think they have sort of started to become more grounded and more evidence-based in their policy making. So I think that's another thing that gives me hope. And then finally, of course, we have agencies, both at federal and state levels, that are trying to grapple with the consequences of AI. And for that, we don't need new legislation. So the FDA can and has actually passed rules or proposed rulemaking around what it means to bring AI products into the medical market. And we likely see the same in other domain-specific agencies.
Yeah, makes sense. By the way, in your book, you had a description of the sort of the hyped up, what you call it, hype crit, like the overhyped critical.
Pretty hype, yes.
Yeah, pretty hype. Yeah, exactly. Which is sort of the opposite of the good news hype is sort of like the absolute doom and gloom like extinction, which is not helpful either, right? As to your point, and if it's receding, that's probably a good thing. So we can actually focus on bad shit like deep fake image generation and the impact on children and others. Which my guess is why it's one of the reasons it's a concern for you. I want to go back to the frontier models, and I want to bring our conversation to us, all of us on this on this chat around sort of our work, right? And this meme that we wouldn't lose our job to AI, we'd lose our job to someone using AI, which I'm not sure I buy anymore. But I just want to talk about the frontier models. Do you agree they seem to be converging in terms of capabilities, and therefore the frontier models are going to pay closer attention to that application layer, and in fact build out their own, sort of apps to try to, to secure that revenue basically, and that, Claude Code or maybe O3, which is not released yet, and when it is released, it could be an amazing coder. And at that point, of course, they can turn off API access to others who are building on those models, maybe if they're building competitive apps. Just what's your sense of frontier models? Are we converging? And does this mean the application layer is sort of where the money's going to get made?
I think we are pretty much converging in terms of capabilities. So I think at this point, we have Google, OpenAI, Anthropic, and Grok from xAI, all at relatively similar levels of capabilities. All of these use reasoning models. There are like little differences here and there. So for instance, OpenAI and Google's products can edit images, while Claude and Grok's cannot. But by and large, these are all like models that have similar capabilities. And if you're using these models for any sort of simple task or application, you won't be any worse off choosing one over the other. Now, what that means is there's like this hyper competitive market. And as you say, that means that there'll like be strict competition on revenue. So already we can see OpenAI's O3 and O1 Pro models. So OpenAI recently released O1 Pro, which is, I think, 10 times the cost of O1 and about 2 orders of magnitude more expensive than their GPT-4o model. So there is this intense competition on price. These models are sort of being priced out. I don't think anyone reasonable is going to use O1 Pro for mass user applications. And what that also means is like these companies are then dependent on the products they sell or the products they create. And so for OpenAI, that is like they have a built-in user base with ChatGPT Pro subscriptions. They recently started to add new product offerings there. So I can think of at least 3 things that they offer in ChatGPT Pro that they already don't offer to like third-party developers. So they offer deep research, which is their product to generate reports, scour the internet, perhaps follow up to 30 to 40 links, spend a few minutes on a task. They have Operator, which is their computer use agent that you can use to carry out tasks on the internet. And they offer image generation online. And I think these are 3 things. I mean, perhaps image generation is something they'll offer in their API at some point. But so far, they haven't indicated APIs coming out anytime soon for deep research or Operator. So in some sense, we're already in the world where OpenAI, at least, has started thinking of productionizing their models and sort of being the real mode. And I think that's also sort of in part because of claims by companies like Meta, who have sort of pledged to openly release their models to, in some sense, reduce the margins of many of the closed model developers. Because Meta doesn't care too much. Their product strategy is to incorporate these models into WhatsApp or Instagram. And on the other hand, they also benefit immensely from all of the community work that goes on Meta's Llama, because it's the de facto standard for open model development. So let's say they release it and then someone figures out a way to run it more efficiently. They've saved like $1 billion in inference compute for running these models. And they've already claimed that they've been doing that internally. And so their business model is entirely different, which adds further pressure on these closed model developers to sort of compete not just on the efficacy of their models, but rather at the application layer as well. Like Google already has its distribution channels. OpenAI has a strong one. As far as I know right now, Anthropic is one company that doesn't have a strong distribution channel. Perhaps their partnership with Amazon will change that. They plan to incorporate Claude into Alexa Plus, which is Amazon's agent. And of course, Grok has Twitter. So you already see this differentiation with the product or the application layer coming into shape for all of these companies.
Yeah, I saw a pretty intrusive Gemini kind of pop up around, to get you to work with AI in the moment, right? It kind of reminded me of what happened to Slack when Microsoft got serious about Teams, right? When you really have that installed base, you can get in their face, with your technology, the solo independent tool. It's a harder road. I could talk a lot about this stuff, especially as it relates to the industry. Is this going to be a public utility, good for consumers with bad business models, or is it going to be one or two winner take all, which is what we've had typically, right, in the last 20 years? digital transformation has meant one or two companies really take the lion's share of the economic spoils. I think that's going to be the outcome, but others, including my good friend, business partner, Scott Galloway, thinks no, it's going to be like the airline industry, a shitty business that's good for consumers. But I want to talk about us now, meaning, the rest of us, we're knowledge workers. We're not sitting inside an AI lab. We're not at Princeton, thinking these deep thoughts. How do you think about, we should be thinking about it in terms of, is it, for example, I talk to users and leaders who say, well, I'm going to wait for this to shake out. It's too confusing. The models are changing all the time. I don't know which one to use myself personally, so I won't use any. And or as a team leader, I hear all the time leaders say to me, well, I'm going to wait a couple of years. It's all a bunch of hype and bullshit. And then when this stuff settles out, then I might kind of make some AI moves. So talk about your advice to us as individuals in the knowledge workforce.
I think one thing that's unique or really different about this current AI technology compared to previous general purpose technologies is that anyone with an internet connection and a few dollars on the credit card has access to the state-of-the-art technology. They can play with it, they can assess its outputs, they can evaluate whether it works well for their needs or not. And crucially, they can understand what the barriers are for adopting these technologies within their institutional setup. This is not something that we could do back in the 1960s or 70s when computers were being developed. You would have to pay an exorbitant amount to get a personal computer back in the day. And so what that really means is, I think there's a lost opportunity almost if you don't already start fiddling around playing with these tools, figuring out what they're good at and what they aren't good at. And one piece of advice that really stuck with me is, when evaluating these tools, I think you really want to assess them based on things you're an expert on and the right answers to, and you can reasonably expect them to be useful for in your work. Because as soon as you veer outside your expertise, it's very easy to think that these models are extremely impressive. But it's within your expertise, within your sort of domain that you want to or might have to adopt these models in, that you can really assess if they're doing work at the quality standards or the reliability standards that you want them to. I don't think it is premature to do this already, even though I claimed earlier that, we have like a long time to go in terms of the product and application development. First, because I think many of the industry leaders who are in these complementary industries will be the ones who create applications that deliver value in the long term in those industries. So maybe this is a missed opportunity to look out for product improvements or pivots or, additional development on that front. An internal tool you build for a company might well be something that becomes a major source of revenue for that company once you sort of start productionizing it and selling it to others. So that's one aspect. But I think the other is, I think it really does help leaders prepare for what's coming. Even if you don't personally want to use generative AI for your work, it's very likely that many of your employees will. And so how do you tell for signs of generative AI use, both good use and misuse of it? How can you sort of prevent sort of being overburdened by, for example, we've seen in law, all of these lawyers getting sanctioned because they're using ChatGPT to generate citations that are hallucinated, that don't really exist. How can you tell for signs of that within your organization? How can you develop policies that incentivize good productive uses and disincentivize this sort of misuse? Or how do you educate your team on what the right way to use these technologies are? I don't think the answer is just don't do it. I don't think the answer is to sort of just come back to AI 5 years from now when the dust has settled. I do think it requires this active investment, both in terms of time and effort, to figure out what the right policies are.
Sure, I buy that, but it does still sound like a science experiment, at least for those of us who have like day jobs, right? And then kids at home and only so many kind of hours in the day, right? Or minutes in the day. I want to put you on the spot here. If you're a CEO, would you sign a 1 or 2 or 3, let's say a 2 or 3 year license agreement for an enterprise AI, ChatGPT for enterprise, Copilot, Gemini, doesn't matter which one, they're all, let's assume they're all roughly the same. Would you sign a 2-year agreement to pay for that for everybody? And then, obviously do the internal work to get it set up and hooked up to your data and, all that stuff, right? And then the training and then the change management and all that's needed really to change behavior. So these employees aren't just anxious and fumbling around, but are actually able to prompt and work with your AI. Would you do that in the expectation of getting a 5, 10, 15, 20, I don't know what the number is, % productivity gain in at least language intensive functions inside the company and language intensive teams, or maybe language intensive industries? Certain industries it may not work, or regulatory issues may mean you don't do that. But like, if you thought about an organization of 1,000 people in this, and the CEO has this option to deploy what I call an off-the-shelf enterprise LLM, would you do it today?
And maybe, I'm not sure if this is a non-answer, but maybe I would start with a small pilot. Maybe I would start with a license for 10 people and see how they do for like 3 months.
Okay, and what do you want? Sure, great. It's not a non-answer. It's good. What would you want to see? 3 months. What is the productivity gain and or feedback you want to get to go from 10 to 1,000?
So I think we've seen a few case studies where companies have done that. I know Ethan Mollick recently published something he did with Procter and Gamble, where productivity gain was like quite literal. So you could see like the number of contracts, let's say. So you want to sort of focus on the end result, not just perceived gains and productivity. But once you're looking at, like, once your metrics are correct, I think a lot of this is downstream of the metrics. So once your metrics are correct, once you can measurably sort of look at the impact on your business, on your ROI, I think the decision is really easy to make. And on the flip side, if the thing isn't working, if AI isn't helping out in this case, I think that will also be much more easily apparent. So if like you have a sales team that outperforms the rest of the company by 15% in the small pilot, perhaps you can expect that, once you roll it out to the entire sales team, it'll be a bit smaller because, these gains would be spread out perhaps a little bit more. But you can reasonably expect there to be this massive gain for frankly, what is not a lot of money. It's like $20 per person. That's, I think, in the ballpark of a Slack subscription per month.
Yeah. So, okay, I don't disagree. Obviously, because that's a service we offer, right? We help clients deploy AI to their workforces. Just not to put words in your mouth, but I'll try. What you're saying is establish a baseline, like really know what you establish really success from a baseline to an expected outcome, something that's presumably measurable besides someone saying, oh, I like working with the AI, or I was able to outsource my drudge work, whatever the hell that means, right? You're actually saying, really try to tie it to output and measurable output, have a baseline, have an after in terms of the outcomes, and see. That makes sense to me. And yeah, if that number goes up a little bit, it feels like the money's a no-brainer, right? The ROI should be there. Are humans getting in the way of this success? Because my observation, Sayash, from current, mostly prospects that we talk to, not our customers. Our customers are happy, but our prospects is their LLM deployments are stalling. That they're struggling to get adoption. They're struggling to get, and therefore ROI. And it seems to me some combination of human anxiety and kind of muscle memory, forgetting to use AI, and struggling with prompting, struggling with managing hallucinations. What are your thoughts?
So I think there'll always be this curve of adoption. And I think a lot of my advice, like in the last answer, was basically for companies that want to be early adopters, leaders in adopting AI. That said, I think these early adopters will also bear the brunt of a lot of these issues. And perhaps like 5 years down the line, we will have, let's say, the Harveys in legal tech and the Hippocratic AIs in medicine that would have much more reliability. And you have like a polished product that you don't need to train your workforce in. But these companies also won't be sort of the leaders in adoption and won't have sort of the first mover advantages that come with adopting AI. And I think that's fine. I think different companies have different risk profiles. So for some companies, it might be that are risk tolerant. It might be great for them to adopt these pilot programs, like spawn off 10 different pilots, figure out the 2 uses of AI that work best, try to incorporate them, spin up their own applications, and so on. For others that are risk averse, I think it's completely fine to sort of say we'll wait it out. There are many missed opportunities, in my opinion, but that's primarily also because I'm quite bullish on the future prospects of it. But I completely agree that, 5 years or 10 years down the line, we will have these applications where you don't have to do this extra legwork of figuring out how to incorporate into your institution, because companies would have found product market fit within it.
And would have had to have done that. And so I'm inferring, and I'm oversimplifying, that maybe at the application layer is where we will have to deal with hallucinations because they seem so persistent at the model layer. Is that how you think about it? I mean, you're smarter than I am. So I could make up an answer. That's what I'm proposing. Can you verify that? Meaning, is that your intuition as well?
I do think so, yes. So I think so far we don't have technical solutions for hallucination. There are none on the horizon. The models have gotten better at it consistently, but not to a point where you have what's often called in the industry like 5 nines of reliability. So you can't get the right answer 99.999% of the time. And so in order to make applications that work well, you now need to incorporate, like, for example, user interface changes that allow you to test these hallucinations. For legal AI, that might mean having like the source citation that you can easily click on and verify, or perhaps a quotation from the source that you can actually go to and verify. For other applications, it might involve giving some sort of a confidence score that the user can then incorporate into their decision of whether to use the AI. And I think that's where a lot of knowledge work might shift, perhaps like 10, 20 years down the line, is in controlling AI outputs, whether it's for reliability, hallucination, or other challenges that arise. I think a lot of it will be domain expertise that's needed to fix these issues in these production environments.
Let's go back to the individual again, Sayash, and I want to go, let's use the scenario as a marketing team. I'm on a marketing team. There's 100 people in the marketing team of different types of marketers, as you can imagine, right? Performance marketers and content marketers, PR people, whatever. Maybe there's no LLM that's been deployed yet, or maybe it has been deployed but poorly, which is, I think, frankly, quite typical, meaning someone bought it, there wasn't any training, there was no change management, everybody's anxious about losing their jobs, but there's a few people using it, right? Like, to your point, there's always early adopters, there's always a diffusion curve kind of thing, or of new technology. Am I worried that I'm now competing for that promotion with someone who is using AI and they will have that little bit of an edge? Like, again, how should we think about this? Is it a material edge to know how to use it well? If you're in a language intensive kind of role, or is it like, yeah, I should know, I should understand it, I should play with it, I should be able to maybe, kind of use it once in a while? Or do you see that, that 5 or 10%, those early adopters, that's typically the number, right, inside of an organization, that they are going to get a sustained advantage over me if I'm not?
So I think there's always the potential for AI to be transformative in any industry. Oftentimes, what we've seen with past general purpose technologies is it's not just incorporating AI into existing workflows that works best, but rather you have to sort of reinvent these institutional forms. So you might have to have this sort of AI native marketing company that thinks about marketing in a completely different way. And that's the real threat. So the threat isn't someone using LLMs to sort of create 3 times the amount of copy. That's like the amount of words you can write has never been a bottleneck for good marketing. But rather like a company that sort of reimagines what it means to do marketing online. I think with past technologies, again, we've seen similar things. So the reason Amazon succeeded wasn't just because they could do e-commerce better or more efficiently than others, but rather because they reconceptualized what might we possibly do on the internet. How could we possibly change how consumers buy and sell content on it? And at the beginning, this sounds like a completely crazy idea because no one is doing it. It's just so out of the blue. No one would give their credit cards to a random person online. But then suddenly, once that becomes possible technically, they're in the position to become the de facto leaders.
Yeah, listen, this is an opening to tell my story about how I went to see Jeff Bezos and tried to buy Amazon for $10 million. But we won't go there. I'm so glad you joined us, Sayash.